first thing this morning. I'm Bona Allen. I'm Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Kajima Building and Design Group. If you're here yesterday, I think I introduced myself, maybe not. But Kajima is based in Tokyo. We first started in 1840, and our focus is architecture, engineering, and construction. Thank you, Dr. Byrne. Thank you so much. Yeah. And so we've got some operations here in the city of New York, and then nationwide as well. Okay, you guys are ready. All right, please help me welcome Vince Ryan, Editor-in-Chief of CFO.com and CFO Publishing. Doug Garis and Rich Wagner, you guys can introduce yourselves in more detail. Please help me welcome these guys. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you can name 5 market indicators that correlate either positively or negatively with your business with at least a 70% degree of confidence? Anyone? So of course we know forecasting is a tricky business. If you knew those 5 market indicators, how would it help you? We're going to do a deep dive into how Masonite Architectural is using the Prevadary tool in just that way. So Doug, if you could introduce yourself first, and then Rich can introduce himself and give us a baseline for what he talked about yesterday.
Sure. Hi guys, how you doing? So my name's Doug Garis. I'm the CFO of Masonite Architectural, which is a large division of Masonite International. We are a large global building products company headquartered in Tampa, Florida. So yes, I had to dig into the back of the closet for my winter coat to come up here. I think it was about 90 degrees when I left. But I just wanted to say that I've been here the last day and a half, and this was an incredibly well-run event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks Doug. And I'm Rich Wagner, founder and CEO of Prevadary. Those that have heard me yesterday talk about economic intelligence, I'll kind of try and summarize. But essentially, when we talk about the value of economic intelligence for companies, it's really their ability to leverage external macro, microeconomic signals and clues about where their business is heading, right? And to use that to make better plans and forecast for the future of their business and every decision that needs to be made with that forecast. Oh, you're welcome.
Great. So Doug, if you could take us through Masonite Architectural's journey, where it started on the way to adopting the Prevadary platform.
Sure. So I actually met Rich, in 2014. We were at an FP&A conference in San Diego, and a colleague of mine, I was in corporate FP&A at the time, a colleague of mine and myself were really in the process of developing some best practices around forecasting. And so we saw Rich do a presentation, and we immediately snapped our fingers and said, hey, we need this. And so just a little bit of a deeper background on Masonite. So Masonite is really an amalgamation of a bunch of different companies that have consolidated through acquisition. So back in 2014, when we met Rich, our FP&A organization and our business unit structure wasn't defined. On top of that, there wasn't a certain set of benchmarks and tools that we could utilize to make sure that we had an adequate look into the future. So that started with our annual operating plan and then our reforecast, which we do 3 times a year. Pretty standard stuff. And so when we saw the tool and the predictive capabilities, we said, aha, there's a way to establish some prudence around our benchmarking process that would inform a much more agreeable and, importantly, a fact-based set of data for us to start the discussion as FP&A, trying to be a business partner, not only to the sales organization, but as well to the CFO and the leadership team to make sure that we could put some confidence behind our short and medium range planning.
And Masonite had gone public in 2013?
In 2013, correct.
Okay, so even more important to get all that
correct
buttoned up.
Yep, absolutely.
So take us through your Masonite architecturals markets and why they may be difficult to forecast and how far out you need to see to help in your planning.
Sure. So if you just to drill in a little bit further, so Masonite Building Products Company, we have a residential piece of the business, which is very closely aligned with new housing activity, building permits, things that are pretty standard, and a lot of folks spend a lot of time and money forecasting. So the first order of business for us as a broad organization was to put in the infrastructure to help us substantiate what we knew, i.e. the housing start data, building permits, and build a much more robust forecast methodology to say we can confirm with a great deal of statistical accuracy that our residential business, for instance, lags new building permits by 9 months. So as a matter of practice for the residential business, it was very easy to say, hey, let's go confirm the things that we know and get sharpened pencil. And then for the things that we don't know, or some of our smaller businesses, our architectural business is a much more niche business. Let's actually develop a composite of market indicators that can give us a much better directional sense of where the business is going, and then let's institute that in a democratized way so that we have that fact-based baseline that takes a lot of the smoke out of the planning process, which is a sales team having a point of view, managing against business leaders who are being tasked to drive growth or cut cost. But in terms of serving as a baseline for our architectural business, it's been a meaningful way for us to say, hey, we have a directional benchmark and we can continue to investigate the things in a niche industry that might not be easily accessible nor easily comparable.
Well, how long did it take to come up with those market factors?
Yeah, so
in conjunction with using the Prevadaire?
Yeah, so when we originally did our proof of value, every company that has several years of data, I think, is a viable customer for you guys. It really started by taking a look at our data set going back like 5 years, right? So monthly data over a 5-year period. Let the correlation engine.
Monthly data of your companies.
Correct. So effectively unit sales and revenue data. So
Okay.
that the first proxy that we used was try to get really tight on the top line forecast, where thinking about Masonite's a vertically integrated OEM. So the cost of bad forecasting for us, which we'll get into, is substantial when you think about the working capital tied up in the business, as well as the potential margin impact of not supplying and moving your products through the supply chain and ultimately to end customers in the most financially viable manner. And so with the development of the benchmarking and the indicators, it was a way for us, again, to take that approach to say, let's get our back-tested data, let's do the proof of value. So any SaaS-based company, right, there's some element of a proof of concept or proof of value. We went in, did the proof of value, and not surprisingly, it was exponentially better than our track record of forecasting and reforecasting.
Sure. Is that the typical process?
Yeah, he did. He outlined a typical process for us, which is, go to a company that has some historical data so we can take a look at seasonality, any kind of unusual event in the past, make sure we understand it, and then we'll run that through our solution. And usually it's a few weeks. We'll know, right away that, hey, we've got some things that are good predictors of where this business is heading. As a matter of fact, we can even go back to last year using those factors, and if we were to use them, how accurate would it be? That builds the confidence in the business and the business leaders to take that to others within the organization and start that transformation process. But very typical approach. Companies do like to, of course, test, want to validate that there are some things out there. They also want to make sure the business will buy in and that they're believable. And a lot of times we're validating or invalidating long-held theories. This impacts our business, right? The quote from yesterday was, well, weather impacts it because when my arthritic knee flares up, I've got a downturn coming in window sales. Well, we can validate, invalidate those in those few weeks, get the business on board, and then really start the discussion of how do we transform the finance function next?
So what's more difficult, finding, like, say, 5 factors or 5 market factors, or winnowing down the market factors to the 5 that,
So I think in well-defined...
or what actually
yeah,
happens?
I think it depends on the industry, right? So
Yeah.
for well-defined industries, it really is a matter of sharpening the pencil to say, we have a basis of things that we know, that we can test, and you're using the power of software and machine learning to do kind of the FP&A analyst function. So it replaces that need in a scalable way. For industries that are niche, there might not be good publicly available data, or there's a level of uncertainty of things that might be correlated or positively or negatively in a like matter and or adjacent matter. That's where using a tool set that you can run to say, hey, we think we know that our market follows these indicators, but what else is out there, right? What might be out there from an economic indicator standpoint did we not think about? And so it becomes, as you get into more niche or specialty businesses like my business is, it becomes that much more imperative to continuously, and I think Rich had mentioned this yesterday, to continuously refresh your viewpoint because things change over time.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And it is in maybe a niche product, niche market, maybe a highly volatile SKU. It takes more time, obviously. And sometimes it's worth the time and effort to do it. There's some layers in your business just saying, well, this SKU really doesn't move the needle that much. That there's times where you got to back up a little bit and maybe go higher into those things that maybe the CEO and CFO care about, major product categories. And maybe we can predict that well, but this niche SKU might not be mature enough yet. And that's okay too. You don't know what you don't know, or you don't know what you can't predict. So we'll take that exercise, but the more niche you get is where you got to do a little bit more time, a little bit more testing. But most things out there have been around quite a while, right? A lot of industries and services and things like auto loans and refis and mortgages completely outside of manufacturing. All those kind of things we can forecast pretty well because demand's been there for a while.
So do you take the guy with the tricky knee totally out of the equation? No gut feel from your salespeople or your marketing people or
so from
CEO?
From a planning perspective, and all the finance professionals in here can appreciate the fact that it is still largely a political process, right? And so you're consistently managing expectations around and against what you've said previously, right? So for companies that have annual planning processes and kind of mid to longer range 3 to 5 year strat plans, you're always going to be benchmarked, and the FP&A and the CFO function, the folks in finance will be continuously reevaluating what the practitioners, the general managers, and the sales leaders in the organization say. What we found, because the gentleman was actually a sales rep in Texas for us, who's still here at Masonite employed, what we found is it was a new way to bring a fact-based discussion that said, hey, it's okay for you to have your anecdotal feedback from customers, because a lot of times, these are the sales reps who are on the ground, feet on the street, talking to customers. But there's often, customers lie sometimes, and there's often
Really?
or they're over aggressive or maybe more pessimistic, and so there's that rationing that you do to say, how much do I believe somebody versus can I actually present them a framework to be a true business partner. We've heard about that, I think, a speaker yesterday about the true value of business partnership. And to me, by democratizing the process, it actually brought our sales organization closer, especially at the regional and territory sales rep level, to say, holy smokes, my market factors are going to be much more aggressive or conservative. Now how do I tailor my sales strategy, unleash SG&A dollars, and potentially allocate capital against those things versus taking, John Doe's sales experience and arthritic knee as the example.
Who did you have to sell this to? This fact-based approach, adopting this new tool.
Yep. So
it sounds like you were the advocate for it.
Yep, sure. So from an advocacy standpoint, and I think Rich can probably expound upon this, it's critical to me, it was critical for our CFO to be the executive sponsor and to cauterize that through the organization to say, hey, look at our performance against our planning, and look how sporadic it's been. It's better for everybody for us to get a better baseline, and then with the general management structure and our business unit leadership teams and ultimately our CEO, it became a much more pragmatic sale once we also had the proof of value and proof of concept data. So that kind of fact-based approach, it had to start within the CFO suite as the arbiter of the directional forecasting of the business. But then once you build the advocacy, it actually became much more of a pull strategy where folks were much more inclined to actually want to see the data and kind of what was behind it.
Is that typical, Rich?
It's the ideal situation and is most typical for us, but not always the case.
Yeah. Do they have to sometimes bring you in multiple times?
It is, and
Talk to the CEO?
Yes, definitely. Sometimes it's driven by the CEO.
Yeah,
right?
that's
If you've
true.
got a very strategic thinking CEO who also, wants to kind of modernize their planning and forecasting process. We've been brought in several times. Sometimes our first meeting, a company that's not name isn't well known or around as long as some of the other companies, we actually get the CEO of multi-billion-dollar companies in the very first meeting because they're a forward-thinking individual. That's awesome. But at the same time, the CEO isn't the one that writes that final check. He may say, go do this, but there's several layers underneath. The best case is when the CFO's aligned. The CFO ultimately, as Doug was explaining to me earlier, you think the CFO is being responsible in that RACI for the forecast. Maybe they don't come up with the actual number and sales has an input in operations, but ultimately they kind of lock and load it into the system, right? And then they go with the CEO to the board meeting and say, hey, we hit these numbers, didn't hit these numbers. So getting the CFO, sometimes up-and-coming VPs of finance, FP&A leads, all on board is imperative, and it'll make the POV and the implementation much more successful. There's still a lot of selling out in the field, right? The sales organization, we've got to get on board. The demand planners and supply chain that are been beaten up for years over forecast and are pretty guarded. We have to get them on board as well. Marketing in certain organizations, they have a bigger responsibility for forecasting than others. So aligning those groups is imperative. CFO, finance support is usually a home run. So I think, yes, it's pretty typical, but it's also really critical.
So we're going to start taking some questions from the audience. I have a lot of other questions to ask, but what do you want? You've been hearing about this tool for 2 days. What would you like to know either from Rich or Doug about how this tool can benefit an organization?
Anyone?
Okay.
I'll ask a question.
Yes.
Yes.
Over here.
Thank you, Bono.
So for our business, we rely a lot on inbound investment from countries outside the U.S. to build manufacturing facilities. Now, let me get over here, sorry.
Yeah.
So with the issues right now globally, trade and others, is there a way to help navigate that process or read the crystal ball using this data?
Yeah, it's we collect data from all over the world, and more of it's becoming available on, well, not just trades, imports and exports, corporate spending and other countries, and the data's available. You can see signals in about everything. The health of other countries, their capital expenditures, their investments overseas, you really can track that, and you'll get some signals of when they're either going to slow down or speed up. It's really about acceleration or deceleration in many cases. And just getting it right, that things are going to accelerate versus decelerate, is important. It may not be a spot-on number. That's okay, but if we say, you know what, for the next 12 to 18 months, it looks like international investment into construction projects or manufacturing, there's really good positive signals that's going to accelerate, then you can make different decisions, right? Working capital investments, expanding staff and others. But if those same signals we're starting to see, 6 out of 8 of them or so are decelerating, you can also start to make smart decisions that protect some of that profit or margin. So I do think it's possible. Almost every company we work with are international. They may be headquartered in the US, but they certainly do business overseas, so we collect that data for them. Same thing on the other case. There's some that are in Europe and Asia that do business in America that we actually help them forecast demand within the United States as well. I hope that answered it.
Did that answer your question, Bona? We got a question. Good.
Hi, I was just wondering how you keep your model updated. So, there's constantly new data coming in. What may predict results today, tomorrow, that those drivers may not be still the case. So you're collecting more and more drivers, then do you work with your client over time to ensure that you have a reasonable level of forecast accuracy? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. Doug may talk a little bit about his business. A lot of businesses are pretty stable. You'll put a model together and maybe you'll see it work extremely well for 6, 12 months. But in addition to that, with technology, you can actually create a score, a health score of a model, right? Some things that tell you how well the model is performing from a mean absolute percent error, right? It's predictive R squared. Once all these new factors come in, like gas price and other things that have changed, we can see the model quality. And what we've done, a lot of times, companies we work with don't always have economists on staff, like Doug's company, right? They may have FP&A and others, but they can't afford economists. So we do offer a managed recurring service where some of our economists will monitor those models. Once a quarter, we'll report to a customer and say, hey, here's what's happening in your models. We took a look, and maybe there's some adjustment needed. Some of the things to watch out for, depends on the industry you're in, of course, but gas price can reach certain thresholds. Maybe if it's below $5 a gallon, it doesn't matter to a consumer. They're going to buy as much as they used to in candy, alcohol, dairy, snacks, and tobacco. But once gas price hits a threshold, maybe it's above, then we start to see things slow down. So we've got some internal knowledge of some thresholds on consumer spending, some thresholds in other industries that tell us we ought to go revisit that model.
Yeah, and I would maybe add to that from what I perceive was what is the kind of process discipline to update the models. And so from a planning perspective, once we built a composite that we felt really good about, we agreed that that was the composite weighted on the market factors that we landed on. We'd evaluate that once a quarter, but largely as a mechanism for our planning process. Any real material change we segmented to once a year. So again, we wanted to make it manageable, starting with revenue forecast accuracy as the primary mode of improvement. But as you kind of drill down, there's things like input cost, right? So there's an exploration benefit of using a scalable tool in software like Prevedere. And then from a process standpoint, you don't have to go in and exert a ton of effort to retrain your models all the time because a lot of that work's being done. But once you have a good planning mechanism, refreshing the model once a year during your annual planning process was very helpful for us and was a way to kind of go back test our current assumptions, make sure nothing materially changed, and also importantly, watching out for things that we might not have expected that either positively or negatively correlated with our business that we couldn't have seen.
Another question.
Oh.
Dramatic changes may happen. I mean, our EM models based on the historical data and the correlation between how certain changes affect the future. But I bet you probably wouldn't predict in 2005 that today Nokia and BlackBerry are obsolete companies. So how you address those changes that may not took place in the past?
Yeah.
But definitely will happen in the future. We know, we just don't know what they are.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you have heard or read, I think there's a book about it, black swan events, right? These kind of once in a decade or so events and things that can happen that are unpredictable. There are some things, hurricanes and weather disasters, we know they're going to happen. They're happening more frequently. We don't know exactly when. So really, I think the best case scenario is when you build a model, there are ways you can check the more recent period versus 5 years ago. and see if there are any market dynamic changes, right, or system changes. So there are opportunities to do that and take a look over the last year. How well did this perform versus 5 years ago? Are we seeing a difference today that's significant enough we ought to take a look at something else? But you really can't predict what you can't predict. Nobody can. If you're going to have a hurricane, exactly where it's going to land, how severe it's going to be, unfortunately, we can't predict that. But we know that there's some ways that we can build a model and we can look back and say, there was a Hurricane Katrina, what happened to this industry? And as soon as we start to get the feeling or the assumption or a little nervousness about something happening that hasn't happened recently that we know could, well, you can do those what-if scenarios and keep up on it. So I think it's yes, you can't predict everything, but if you could react faster once you start to see some signals or signs that are different and get ahead of that, that's the only way to prepare for the unpredictable.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to add on that too, to give comfort around the fact, and certainly part of our business case was the over-optimism in a return to normal for a housing market recovery. So 50-year historic new housing starts in the US as 1.5 million starts per annum. Starting in 2011, 12, 13, all the kind of preeminent research institutions were anticipating this hockey stick return to normalcy, which we're still, I think, in the 1.2, 1.3 million starts. So we're still below our 50-year historical average. And so and when we went and back-tested the data, the back-testing of the data told us clear as day that the bodies that we normally depended on for forecasting that were predicting, a 40 or 50% growth year over year were absolutely incorrect. And we shouldn't have used that as a baseline for planning our organization. And so the comfort in kind of training on not being overly optimistic is, to me, and was to our organization, as meaningful of a benefit as, you can't, as Rich mentioned, you can't prepare for the black swan events, but any edge that you can build into your process to where you have that intelligence is, worth its weight in gold.
So what's housing going to do in 2020? Come on, Doug. No, you go ahead. Just give us a couple of sentences.
And we've been out, we're a publicly traded company. We don't usually issue updated forward-looking guidance. But the housing market, we haven't seen a level of recovery that we would have expected, and we haven't really seen material new housing start and building permit data. So there's a whole lot of whys behind that, but we're kind of operating in an environment to where we've at least built an organization around understanding what those trends are in the short and medium term.
Sure. Any other questions before we go on? So let's get to the benefits of this, what it enabled Masonite to do as a company, especially financially, cutting costs, et cetera, improving operations.
Sure. So I mentioned the original business case for us was we have a top-line forecasting issue, and that categorically presents supply chain and networking capital real kind of sunk cost, and the cost of bad forecasting is evident, right? I'm sure you guys all know this. And so that was the original proof of value. So for us to get much better from a revenue top-line forecasting process, we were able to tailor our approach to improve our supply chain planning. And Rich had mentioned the development of really robust, I would call it a RACI matrix if you're familiar with that. So making sure there was clear accountability and responsibility, and making sure that our S&OP organization, partnering with finance and the business, had an appropriate level of oversight across the organization. So that was kind of the first step for us.
But what were you able to do as a result in the supply chain? Cut costs?
Yep, so two main benefactors. So from a net working capital standpoint, being vertically integrated, absolutely able to take net working capital out of our organization to better service our business. And then from a supply chain logistics cost standpoint, being vertically integrated, we move a lot of stuff internally through our plant network. And then from an external third-party logistics standpoint, we were able to improve our margins by having a better confidence in our forecast and better optimizing our supply planning around our internal movements as well as external customer shipments.
Were those material benefits?
Yeah, so it's a mix of material and logistics and warehouse cost, right? So when you think about, overhead utilization, we have over 65 large manufacturing facilities across the world. That costs a lot of money to keep up and running. So on a fixed and variable overhead basis, being able to better plan for demand allows you to better operate your facilities as well as organize your labor populating those facilities. From a material cost standpoint, if you buy too much stuff and it sits for too long, right, you have inventory write-down. So our reduction of obsolete and slow-moving inventory is a huge value proposition that gets tied up with some of the other networking capital, right? So you can improve your inventory position and then also reduce the stuff that you produce that is in excess of what you need to run your business. And then finally, I mentioned the logistics piece. Our logistics cost from an internal perspective is close to as high as our delivered cost to our customers. So those 4 areas, especially in our cost structure, there was 2 or 3 big chunks of value that we could drive through each one.
So how soon does the platform basically pay for itself?
So what I'll say is from a proof of value and a back testing, the next quarter, we were at least 50% better.
Wow.
So you can, you don't even have to do the math to understand that for, a SaaS-based model at a fraction of your total SG&A investment, that it was a good idea. But as you continue to look forward, again, that the ongoing benefit via the service-based model and what the kind of the nominal annual fee is something we don't have to spend a whole lot of time trying to explain or justify the value, because it's, again, the value is in excess of whatever our annual software costs are.
Is that typical, Rich?
Yeah, so what we've built is something that I mentioned yesterday. Cloud computing is really enabled, right? Machine learning is really enabled. But what's happening in technology is it's getting cheaper. One of the few things that's getting better is also getting cheaper, right? Storage and memory, compute power. And for me as a company to build in a cloud environment and not have dozens of servers hosting data for customers like Masonite, this makes it really affordable. This is an add-on. It's not an ERP system that you've got to replace and invest tens of millions of dollars in people and time to. This is something you can turn on very quickly because of cloud computing, because of connectivity into other systems is readily available. That for customers, the ROI is really simple. The hard dollar cost he's mentioned and pay for it in days probably or weeks. The other is if you're a CEO or CFO, one right decision you make. If you're in a $100 million or even $1 billion company, you say, you know what, we slowed down or we went ahead, we entered a new market, we exited a market, they can be worth millions or sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. And if there's more confidence by having a little bit more of the right information to support it, it obviously pays for itself. On the risk side, it's not only risk and cost, right? If we carry too much inventory, this excess obsolete. If we have stockouts where we're leaving money on the table. But as I mentioned yesterday, CEOs and CFOs not seeing the future correctly, it's really a career risk. It's a personal risk, right? How many times can you go to the board and say, well, we've missed our forecast again, and something the board believes is something you can and should be able to forecast, right? So there's lots of ways to look at the ROI, but the affordability of technology today and the availability of data, you'd be surprised, how fast you can get the money back that you've invested in it.
So, Doug, this also helped you on in talking to investors and analysts, correct? Giving them a better picture of
Yeah, and so
performance.
as I mentioned, we, by virtue of our publicly traded status, we update guidance once a year. Having an integrated planning approach that's believable, that investors and analysts can get behind, especially from a story. And then to Rich's point, having the executive team be strongly apprised of and confident that they can build a story around what they know to be true from a market-based standpoint is inherently value add to the organization.
So, are other areas of Masonite, other business units or whatever you call them, thinking of adopting this, or what's
Yeah.
the?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the top level forecasting was the big solve for Masonite, right? Getting
Right.
a baseline that we felt comfortable. And as we look at some of our businesses across, we have several large businesses in Europe, trying to understand the market factors there, as well as drilling deeper into some of our input costs that aren't immediately forecasted at other than, we think fuel cost is going to inflate by 3% per year. Here's our planning assumption. Corporate FP&A issue it to the entire organization, and that's an assumption in your model. So the ability to smartly start to explore some of the areas that historically haven't been well thought of during a planning process is the exploration process that's afforded by using a piece of software like this.
You sound like you're very advanced in data analysis and data science for a CFO. Do you have people like that on your staff also doing that?
So the short answer is no. But when you look at the kind of correlation engine and the software product, all you need to understand is positive and negative correlation, right? And so you don't have to be, a PhD stat or a data science person to understand directionally how your individual business drivers are with or against certain market conditions. And so the software is elegant in providing that guidance without having to peel behind the curtains and understand all of the resulting statistical data, which is very important, but that is done at scale in lieu of having an organization trained to do that. So for us, between our supply chain team, which is innately a little bit more sophisticated from a forecasting and statistics standpoint, and then the divisional finance and corporate FP&A teams, that partnership has been inextricably linked to help synthesize that information in a consumable format to the executive team without using R-squared and correlation, giving a much more a simple barometer of where we think the market factors and the performance benchmarks are going.
So one of the things Doug said, it kind of resonated, and maybe the question was geared a little differently, but do you find a lot of finance individuals that are open to analytics and technology today in companies, right? Inherently, we know the demographic of CFOs of large organizations doesn't vary much. To be frank, there is a very similar type of individual and years of experience that becomes a CFO. This transition to those that are a little more analytical and embrace technology is happening pretty quickly. The last session, they talked about the speed of change, business cycles changing in 3 years versus 6 or 10 or 18 months when you're digital media. That takes a different mindset, right? You've got to have and be armed with technology to be able to change the way you operate. And we're seeing more and more of it in organizations that, yes, CFOs in finance are owning technology, and a lot of times the analytics data science team may report there. They're owning the CIO and IT. So I think they're embracing it more, and we're seeing more of it. As far as the ability to understand the back office or machine learning and AI, you really don't have to. And why, as I say, almost every decision made in a large organization during planning and forecasting, it's based off a PowerPoint that's backed by Excel, a spreadsheet, right? So if we can get our insights into that Excel file, here's what the market's saying, you can have someone prepare it, or you prepare it for your board and say, hey, here's the PowerPoint for our forecasting and planning session, and guess what? We've looked at external factors. That's really as technical as you need to be able to start consuming it. And for us, that's what we've seen, kind of the way people actually integrate it in the process. Well, the common tools and technology where the results go is what's important, because decisions are still made 99% of forecasting and planning in Microsoft Excel, and then PowerPoint is how boards receive information, how big decisions are made still.
How do you change that culture from data to data-driven decision-making? I've been in all size kind of organizations, and very few of them, base their decisions on data.
Well, the best case or best time for that was when there's a big miss, right? when right now what we're seeing is softness in the economy for 2020. Big question, right? We've been kind of fat and happy for several years. Companies that are growing top-line revenue, they're not looking to change to a data-driven organization as fast as somebody that's just felt the pain of it. And right now we're seeing many industries that are in decline, right? We've got the steel industry, chemical, automotive, housing and construction that have been riding pretty good waves. But what happens now when things get rocky, we get lots of calls, right? So it's a matter of feeling the pain and having that pain and it being deep enough and wide enough that somebody says there is a better way to do this and I need to do it. But it takes an event, it really does. If you're making 10% year over year, growing 20%, you're probably not going to change to a data-driven organization. But as soon as you start to see some of the shortcomings, you're going to have to lean on or look toward technology to start changing the way you do business.
That might be a good market indicator in itself. How many inbound calls is
Yeah.
Private Dairy getting?
It's when we're counter-cyclic to the economy. When things get rocky, people want to understand what's driving it. They all have some assumptions, as we mentioned, and we test. But really, that's what we've seen in the past. And certain industries at certain times, of course, create demand. But right now, we're seeing lots of industries that are. We're still seeing the consumers doing pretty well, employment's well, consumer spending's, kind of bracing up the economy, but those things behind it are pretty volatile right now.
I mean, that service where you talked about I don't know if you called it a managed service where your economists go over. So you have some access to the data that your clients are seeing.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me strikes me as extremely valuable.
Yeah.
Are you planning on doing anything with that data?
Yeah, so data monetization is one thing we hear. Lots of companies, insurance companies and others talk about it, yes, from themselves. GM and others can offer, MasterCard offers data for sale, and love for companies like ours to use that insight to help some customers and be kind of a resale channel. That's one way we're seeing some of our customers come to us is they'd like to index some of their data, de-identify it from a personal standpoint, and maybe monetize it. And now GM knows that that's a small part of their overall giant business, right? It's not going to kill it, but at the same time, it may fund some analytics projects and initiatives. And then the other side of that is we do get intellectual capital and knowledge of what drives Dollar General and Racetrack Petroleum and Masonite, ExxonMobil, some of our customers, that we learn because we can go into other similar industries, similar companies, we know. And then the others is machine learning is really a way for us to do it that we'll take what we've learned from ExxonMobil this year, a classification engine that are available will start to classify very similar data that could be great leading indicators for that industry. So our data itself is learning, right? In the data repository. So the next time we go to a similar customer in a similar industry, well, the time it takes to find those leading indicators from a machine learning standpoint is very fast. We've done it before. Our people that go educate the CEOs and CFOs maybe quarterly and say, here's what we're seeing, well, they've done this several times. They're gaining that intellectual capital as well. We can never share what's in a company's model, right? We can't say this is what X, Y, and Z look at, and it's the exact model. But inherently, our machine's learning, and we're learning internally at what drives certain industries. So I do think there's lots of value, even in financial services, right? There's ways you can do it that's not going to, open up the company that's doing it or expose them to what they're looking at, that our machines learn and everybody else benefits from.
I think you guys need to partner with like Robert Shiller or someone and come up with an economic performance index, forward-looking.
We do have some composite industry leading indicators, and we're on NPR and Forbes. Our economists are. They're much better at this than we do. But you're right. We've learned directionally what drives lots of industries and seen them be really accurate. So that is something that we do a little bit of. A lot of it, though, is working with enterprise companies, financial services, insurance, pharmaceutical, all the way down to construction manufacturing.
So any last questions? We have a couple of minutes.
Can I speak without the mic?
Sure.
Sure.
I think it was Rich, you made that comment earlier. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were seeing, the the CI role, it's somewhat reporting to the CFO role. Is that correct, or that's not correct?
Yeah, we are seeing more of that in analytics, market insights. Yes.
Got it. So here's my question. So, if you look at traditionally the reporting line, it's more CFO, CIO, sort of reporting directly to the CEO. I do see the emerging technology piece actually is integrating with the finance piece, right? Because that's where all the data is coming from. That's where the value is. So, when you look at it, the data is new electricity, right?
Yep.
With that said, do you foresee the future of CFO will be a more integrated role, as somewhat like a CFO, CIO combined, or you would see more as the CIO reporting to the CFO role?
Yeah.
You follow what I'm saying? So it's because if it's the former, then that means that the CFO has to be even more technological savvy than as in the past.
Yeah, there's some interesting things going on. I came out of IT for about 14 years, right? And that was my opportunity as this company or CIO of a large firm. And what's happened is I do see more CIOs reporting to the CFO. I even see some organizations that no longer have a CIO. And they just have somebody, an analytics lead or a market insights lead or a technology lead that does it. But I see the CFO becoming more strategic than technical by far, really a strategic partner. Even in my business, which is smaller, our finance lead is in every board meeting with me. And we're talking strategy, and they understand sales, they understand our market, they understand our business. I don't know if they have the time and capacity to also understand technology. But at the very least, what I'm seeing is, finance is seen as a strategic business partner and more of almost a chief strategy officer and CFO combined that really understands market and the business, right? And can incorporate that into financial planning. So that's what I'm seeing more of. CIO, in a lot of organizations we go in, and you guys probably have heard this, a lot of the CFO and finance people say, I don't want to get IT involved. Right? They're too controlling and they're going to limit what we do and I'm not going to be able to install it. That's a shame, because when I did it, I wanted to be a strategic partner in the business as well and learn what the CFO wanted and needed. So I reached out and do that. And I think the CIOs that are going to survive and going to add value to the organization are going to go away from being a controlling to also being a little bit more strategic partner in the business. But I see that as a part of the business that sometimes gets a black eye. And I don't know if the CFO wants to take on that technology lead either, or has the capacity, if that answered it.
Okay, great. I think we'll end there.